Prior to his current position, tonight's keynote speaker served as the Utah Department of Natural Resources Director from 2012 to 2017. Over the course of his 25-year career in natural resources, he played a pivotal role in restoring many of Utah's fish and wildlife species to levels not seen in more than 125 years, increasing Utah's mule deer population by more than 100,000 animals within the past 4 years, improving and restoring more than 1.3 million acres of wildlife habitat as part of Utah's Watershed Restoration Initiative, working to conserve greater sage grouse, so a listing under the Endangered Species Act was unnecessary, launching a new migration initiative that uses cutting-edge technology to better understand and manage wildlife populations, creating the Utah Cutthroat Slam, a program to generate conservation funding for Utah's 4 native trout species, cultivating the public's passion for wildlife and conservation through expanded youth hunting and fishing days, annual pheasant releases, and other hands-on wildlife events, and also serving in leadership positions in multiple national wildlife organizations. It is my honor and privilege to introduce the Principal Deputy Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mr. Greg Sheehan.
Thank you, Daryl. I also want to thank my good friends Gray Thornton, Kevin Hurley, Clay Brewer, and others at the Wild Sheep Foundation, as well as the board and the many members of the Wild Sheep Foundation who are here this evening. It's great to be here among friends to talk about a shared passion for hunting in the outdoors. Like most of you here this evening, I too have a great passion for wild sheep and their enhancement both in North America and around the world. I've been fortunate to hunt and successfully harvest the Dall sheep in North America and could say that it is among my most memorable hunting experiences. There's a thrill that comes with hunting in some of the most remote country in the world where man cannot control every element of his or her environment. In places where we must use caution and give great heed to dangers such as dehydration, hypothermia, bears, slippery ledges and rock slides, fast-moving river crossings, questionable pilots, and so many other threats that can end a hunt or a hunter. These risks only make the rewards better at the end of the journey. But just as man can be made vulnerable in these environments, so too can the sheep themselves. While hunters sustainably harvest a very small part of the population of sheep each year, we know that the real threats to our wild sheep are population-level die-offs from disease, loss of habitat, or in areas where predators key in on isolated sheep populations, driving them down to non-recoverable levels. These are the threats that we must come together to solve. Working with the Wild Sheep Foundation, there are strong partnerships built between states, the federal government, other nonprofit conservation groups, and perhaps and most importantly, each of you as sportsmen and women. Before moving to Washington, D.C. last year to lead the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Trump administration, I served as Director of Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. During my 25 years with the State Wildlife Agency, I was honored to have worked with so many wildlife professionals who are committed to sustaining and expanding our wild sheep populations. As we worked as a state agency side by side with our dedicated volunteers, we put thousands of hours and millions of dollars into on the ground by creating new sheep units through translocations, performing disease monitoring, and installing guzzlers, just to name a few. Many of those professionals, as well as dozens of volunteers for local chapters of the Sheep Foundation, are here tonight. I also saw my good friend Tony Wasley earlier, the Nevada State Director, who's been instrumental in the tremendously successful wild sheep program here in Nevada. There's so many here tonight that have contributed. In fact, could I ask anyone here to take just a break for a moment and ask anyone here in the room that has ever participated in field activities for the benefit of wild sheep to please stand. That can include professional biologists, volunteers, landowners, or others. If you could all stand up and we could recognize and see those folks out there. Let's have a hand for each of them. Wow. You know, that's really what conservation's all about. And these individuals who just stood up before you, and those of you who have brought so many dollars to sheep conservation, have brought sheep back in America. So what have we really done, working with all of you and those partners who just stood up? And what do the numbers tell us? Nationally, we have seen an overall increase of sheep populations take off in the last 40 years. In Utah, we went from 300 sheep in the 1960s to over 4,500 today. For several years now, I've been promising Gray Thornton we'd hit 10,000 sheep in Utah one day. Now, being in DC at the Fish and Wildlife Service, I'll need to work on that goal from a couple thousand miles away. But that work has begun. Recently, I met with the newly appointed U.S. Forest Service Chief Tuke and asked him to help us work together to solve conflicts with spatial separation between the domestic sheep industry and the wild sheep populations. These are very real and often difficult conflicts we must resolve. But we also must acknowledge that domestic wool growers also have rights on the landscape that must be respected. But there are solutions, and we'll continue to work together with all parties to enhance our wild sheep. Last year, under the Trump administration, Mr. Ryan Zinke was confirmed as the Secretary of Interior. Secretary Zinke, a former Navy SEAL commander, is a Westerner like many of you. He was raised in the mountains of northwestern Montana, where wild sheep are still commonplace. As he came into this role, his first secretarial priority was to create a conservation steward legacy, second only to Teddy Roosevelt. Just like Teddy Roosevelt, the Secretary understands that our hunters and anglers are the ones that continue to deliver on-the-ground conservation and the dollars that pay for that conservation. As he has built this administration, he's taken proactive measures that our hunters and anglers are the ones that continue to deliver on-the-ground conservation. Some of the things he's specifically done: first, ensuring that all of his politically appointed staff, including myself, are hunters and anglers. Second, Secretary Zinke has chartered a new council called the Hunting and Shooting Sports Conservation Council to advise him and other Department of Interior agencies about the directions we should be focusing on to drive hunting and shooting sports considerations back into the federal government. If you or anyone you know is interested in participating on this council, please apply to the Department of Interior website by January 29th. For those of you who are interested in hunting and wildlife conservation across America or outside of America, the Secretary has chartered the International Wildlife Conservation Council. Those members will advise him on the benefits that hunters bring to wildlife conservation throughout the world. He's also issued secretarial orders to enhance conservation stewardship and recreation, including hunting and fishing recruitment, and providing the needed access for those who participate on hundreds of millions of acres under the control of the Department of Interior. At the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have 566 refuges that cover more than 150 million acres. But only 2 in 3 refuges allow hunting, and even fewer, just over 50%, have fishing opportunities. Those percentages are not acceptable. I know that we can open many more of these 192 refuges that are currently not open for hunting. In October, we reassigned 12 employees spaced throughout the country to work full-time on refuge access issues, with the goal of opening another 250,000 acres of hunting by the end of this calendar year. They're also tasked with streamlining and simplifying overburdensome or archaic hunting and fishing regulations on wildlife refuges to align more closely with state regulations. This will relieve yet another barrier to those wanting to enjoy our refuges and public lands for hunting and fishing. Following the lead of conservation groups and state wildlife agencies, We have fully embraced the R3 movement of recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters and anglers. This year, we've mapped out more than 400 recruitment and reactivation events to develop new sportsmen and women, youth, veterans, disabled citizens, and others that need just a little help and mentoring so they too can participate in the passions that we've enjoyed throughout our lives. We believe these efforts will begin to turn the tide from those who may not otherwise have other mentors who can help them learn about our passions and pastime. The last area I want to talk about and discuss this evening is one that I know we're all very concerned about. That is the evolving societal disconnection of wildlife and wild places. And more importantly, to many here in the room tonight, the belief by a changing society that regulated hunters are causing a decline of wildlife species in America and around the world. Everyone in this room understands what hunters have brought to the wildlife conservation table in America for the past 100 years, and how nearly all species have benefited and rebounded from those efforts. Licenses and permits, duck stamps, firearms and ammunition excise taxes, and on-the-ground restoration work have been funded by hunters and anglers. Yet urbanization and societal pressures are keeping people away from the sport, or making those that do hunt more fearful of disclosing their interest to the public through pictures and social media. I was talking with a concession operator from Africa while at the Dallas Safari Club show 2 weeks ago, and he told me that more than half of his clients last year asked not to have their pictures printed in the annual brochure that they publish for future marketing purposes. Even as hunters, we have, in many cases, become fearful of extolling the virtues of our favorite pastime. It's time for us to come together as sportsmen and women, as conservation groups, and as individual conservationists to develop the messaging that lets the world know that sustainable, regulated hunting is acceptable, that the meat we harvest is a healthy, necessary, and acceptable source of protein, and that our wildlife populations to continue to thrive and be protected because of hunters, and that mankind themselves are hardwired to responsibly use our wildlife, just as all of our forebears for thousands of years have done before us. But at the same time, we need to make it clear that the poaching and illegal killing of wildlife in Asia, Africa, and even right here in America is not what we support or believe in. We cannot allow the anti-hunting community to believe a message that hunters are poachers. This is the picture that they are trying to paint now as we struggle to make our case with an often biased or uninformed media and public. I'm proud to say that I'm a hunter, and that I've hunted in Africa more than once and other parts of the world, as well as the United States for over 40 years. In fact, I purchased my last African hunt from a vendor here at the Wild Sheep Show just 2 years ago. As we work to solidify hunting and conservation for the future, I would also ask that you take the time and effort to take a young person, friend, neighbor, coworker, or other out into the field on their first hunting trip. Please give back to conservation by providing that mentorship that someone once provided to each of you. I will leave you tonight with my highest admiration for each of you as hunters and conservationists, and want you all to know that this administration, including Secretary Zinke and myself, understand your interests and passion for hunting and will continue to fight for your hunting rights and opportunities. Thank you, travel safely, and enjoy your time here at the Wild Sheep Show.